So before we begin, I want to first thank Dennis Kelleher and his team at Better Markets and Professor Art Wilmarth and his staff here at his staff here at GW. And what our plan is to have each of the panelists deliver a 5-minute opening statement. And after that, I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask a couple questions of each of them. And then we will open up to you all here to ask them questions. So I would like to begin by asking Professor Coffey to begin speaking.
I'm a law professor, and I always stand when I face a class. That's because it's all right if you fall asleep, but it's very embarrassing if I fall asleep. I am following, of course, Elvis. When you follow Elvis, you got to recognize you're not going to be listened to that carefully. So I'm going to make one big point and try to corroborate it with 3 short examples. The big point is that the classic strategy used by Congress in response to a financial crisis no longer works, and we've got to improvise with newer strategies. The classic strategy, followed in Dodd-Frank, was to delegate vast discretionary power to the financial regulatory agencies. That made sense because the usual reasons for giving power to administrative agencies is that they can fine-tune things to specific contexts, they can respond to new information, they can adjust. Congress would write overbroad prophylactic rules, it is said. Now, that's the usual reason for deferring to administrative agencies. It has not worked. 5 years later, I think we now have to realize that we are seeing administrative paralysis. Every financial regulatory agency that has put out a broad rule has had to cut it back, sometimes cutting it back 50% or more, and that process is still continuing. All right? They are not only paralyzed, they are inundated, and they are unable to meet the pace set by Congress. Beyond that, they are extremely risk-averse right now. They are focusing on the trivia rather than the broader issues. At some agencies, and here I'm picking on my favorite agency, the SEC, they're showing more of an instinct for the capillary than the jugular. That's because vision is dangerous. Vision gets you in trouble. Focus on the narrow little issues of meeting tomorrow's deadline. As a result, 5 years later, I think for the most part, with some exceptions, we are facing administrative agencies that are rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic and doing little else. Okay, why is that happening? First of all, I got to qualify what I'm saying. I certainly do recognize that the financial regulatory agencies are staffed by people who are smart, honest, and hardworking. But also, they are intimidated, somewhat demoralized, inundated with too much work, and as a result, very risk-averse. Why is this happening? Political scientists could address that better than me, but among the reasons are Citizens United, the new importance of political contributions, and the new power of lobbying. There is also our political polarization. There are other factors, but the factor I would stress that's most important in terms of the immediate performance of regulatory agencies is that, like Banquo's ghost hanging over this whole environment, is the D.C. Circuit, which is being read by administrative agencies to mean even after long and due diligence research, you adopt rules. They may be invalidated based on a very subjective set of criteria, cost-benefit analysis by the D.C. Circuit. Okay, if we had full time, I would give you 3 examples. First is money market funds, where everyone recognized that money market funds are the new highest risk factor. I'm not predicting their failure, but under circumstances of financial stress, they all could fail. They could fail because 3 factors. Money market funds have no loss absorbency. They don't have a capital buffer. They replace savings banks, but unlike savings banks, they do not have capital. There is an incentive to run. It's rational for investors to be first in line in running, and thus we have a scenario under which the money market funds could experience a giant run on the funds. What's happening in response to this? The FSOC and Mary Shapiro both recognized that there were these problems. Nothing could be done. As a result, we have seen merely a cosmetic solution, the idea of letting net asset value fluctuate. That's no substitute for requiring more capital. We need capital in money market funds, and Europe has just recognized this. Within the last 2 weeks, Europe has required money market funds to have a 3% capital buffer. which is exactly what the Financial Stability Oversight Council recommended for money market funds. I can't go any further there. The other two that I would point to, credit rating agencies where no one at the SEC is willing to take seriously Senator Franken's idea or the broader idea that we won't have true reform unless we shift from from the issuer pays model to some form of investor pay or subscriber pay system under which at least the end users get control over the selection of the rating agency. I don't have time to go further on that. The last point, which you heard Senator Warren also mention, OTC derivatives. This is the area where AIG failed and probably the most important failure. What has happened? The G20 nations agreed collectively that the answer had to be clearinghouses, exchange trading, more margin to eliminate counterparty risk. What has happened? There have been reasonably good rules prescribed, but the industry has outflanked them. The industry has come up with a very shrewd strategy. They call it substituted compliance. Under substituted compliance, if you are in compliance with the host country's rules, you're deemed to be in compliance with the U.S. rules. That means that if you are an American financial institution and you conduct your OTC derivatives business, your swaps business, your credit default business offshore, you can play a giant game of regulatory arbitrage under this heading of substituted compliance if the American agency will say that the foreign system is reasonably functionally similar to our own. This is the battle that still is being played out now. We don't know what the outcome would be, but we face a future world in which all of Dodd-Frank can be trivialized by an immense game of regulatory arbitrage as major banks move their higher risk activities offshore, and major banks are essentially very mobile institutions, and that nullifies anything that's in Dodd-Frank if substituted compliance lets you take your activities offshore and then engage in the higher risk activities based on complying with the local country's laws. I'm telling you simply that we are seeing regulatory agencies largely outflanked. We have to come up with some new strategies. To some degree, I think we have to hold the agencies accountable, not just the banks, but the agencies. They are tolerating a little too much under the pressure of strong lobbying. That uses up my 5 minutes, and I'll turn it back over to the panel.
Thank you so much, Professor Coffey. Neil, would you like to speak?
No.
Okay, thank you.
I think as hearing the comments of Senator Warren and Dennis's compelling slideshow, and as a former federal prosecutor, trying to summarize 5 years in 5 minutes, I think the issue that really strikes me is accountability. And Senator Warren posed the question, 5 years ago, did we really think that we would have banks that are the top banks being 30% larger than they were today? But I think on the individual accountability, it's somewhat staggering the lack of accountability that we've seen in the past 5 years. And when we're talking about accountability, I think it's sort of two different areas. The one that I think that people most frequently talk about is, of course, those responsible for the crisis in the private sector. Those in Wall Street who drove their institutions and with them not only the national but the global economy into a ditch, and sort of what happened to them. And accountability matters, of course, because if there's no accountability, if the people who are responsible for immoral, illegal, or just stupid acts are actually able to profit off of them and not be held accountable, that's going to, of course, incentivize future misconduct and won't deter bad conduct. And of course, there, it's been well publicized, the ledger is pretty shocking. It's not just that not a single major executive at a major firm responsible for the crisis has gone to jail. They haven't been charged with fraud. This is the crisis without fraud, we would be led to believe. The amount of money, the monetary profit that they were able to extract from these institutions before they went off a cliff is somewhat staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars for certain individuals, and for the most part, they got to keep every single penny. And those are the types of negative incentives that will inevitably teach someone else who's in a similar situation that the best thing to do is to take the high risks, extract as much profit as you can in the short term for your own bottom line, and well, frankly, it's the taxpayers and the shareholders' problems. And that's not to say that they didn't lose money when their stock prices crashed, but again, I think it's somewhat buffered by the hundreds of millions they were able to extract. But I think sometimes it gets lost of just talking about individual accountability on Wall Street and not talk about the other thing that Senator Warren referenced, which is the individual accountability on the regulator side. Because as bad as the conduct was on Wall Street, it could not have happened and would not have succeeded without their enablers in Washington and the regulatory structure, who cheerleaded the most destructive practices and I think similarly have not been held accountable. Senator Warren talked about those incredibly important moments in the latter part of the Clinton administration where we saw Graham Leach Bliley rip out Glass-Steagall, where we saw Brooks Lee Bourne and her efforts to regulate derivatives, smack down through and eventually through legislation that excised them from the regulatory landscape. So what happened there? Who were the individuals behind that? And again, we see sort of a staggering lack of accountability. Robert Rubin, who was, of course, Secretary of the Treasury who oversaw this, what happened to him? Well, of course, after making sure that the law got passed that created the Frankenstein monster of universal banks, he went and ran it as chairman and again extracted more than $100 million before its failure, of which he kept every penny. Larry Summers, of course, who's the person who famously made the call to Brooks Lee Bourne and said, I have 13 bankers in my office, and if you try to even raise the idea of regulating derivatives, it will destroy the global economy. Well, of course, he became one of the chief architects of our response to the financial crisis. And if that hasn't been sort of tepid enough as Dennis and Elizabeth Warren's presentations made, of course, now he's going to likely be the nominee to run the Fed. And then, of course, Tim Geithner, who had a very significant role as president of the New York Fed, and even though without any degree of irony he announced to Congress that he had never been a regulator, in fact, well, I guess actually it's true, but as president of the Fed had regulatory responsibility over the New York-based bank holding companies, including the recidivist bailout T-City, and who made a staggering speech looking back on it in 2007 as the crisis began to take hold, talking about how good financial innovations, CDOs and CSs, and how they were actually smoothing out the risk in the financial system when they were actually the ticking time bomb that ultimately blew it up. He, of course, was given the keys to the Treasury Department and running the bailout. And so I think that, overall, when you look at the lack of accountability, what's happened in the last 5 years is somewhat sadly predictable. When Senator Kaufman's bill that would have really dealt with too big to fail, it was, of course, those same regulators who had been elevated to high positions, Summers and Geithner, who helped lead the charge against it from the White House. And I think if we don't learn our lessons about accountability, along with all the other perverse incentives that are still in our system, there's a good chance we're headed towards another potentially more significant financial crisis. But before my time expires, we're told to say something nice and positive. So I will say this. I think the financial crisis and its aftermath has been an incredibly dark cloud. But the one silver lining I can think of, we most assuredly probably would not have a Senator Elizabeth Warren without it. So on that note, that's my silver lining for this dark cloud.
Professor Galbraith.
Well, I'm, first of all, very happy to be here at this 5th anniversary celebration. I'd like to say that the financial crisis was the acute phase of, and really the start of an economic crisis which continues. When we speak about the lessons learned and how to prevent things from happening again, we are already distorting the actual situation as it's experienced by most people. And Senator Warren made this point. I'll make it, just reemphasize it. If you are a working person or a homeowner, or a teacher, or librarian, or a park ranger, if you rely on unemployment insurance or food stamps, crisis has not ended. And after 5 years, you have probably realized that it isn't going to end. And so the first question one has to ask is, why not? I think the failures of policy and accountability, supervision, Neil Borofsky, Professor Coffey already mentioned are a part of it, but they're not the whole story. there's a larger framework here, which goes back much further in time. The first being we no longer control the resource prices that we face in the private economy. We used to. Not true anymore. So business faces a much more unstable environment. We used to be, as a country, at the head of a well-organized international system with a clear purpose to provide an alternative to the Soviet Union. It's no longer true. It hasn't been true for a long time. And it has become manifestly more untrue as that system recedes in time. We have and are experiencing very rapid technical change, which can raise living standards, but also has a very powerful effect reducing the demand for labor. So a great many people who were necessary to the old technologies are not necessary in the new ones. And so for all of these reasons, we need to think about how to secure our future and how to restructure the way the economy works. And on top of that, we papered over these issues and relied for a generation on the financial system to generate the growth experiences that we had. It came in two major waves. The technology boom in the 1990s, which ended in a crash in 2000, and the real estate boom, the mortgage boom, I should say, that came to an end in 2007. And that bears some very special investigation or thinking about. Why did we have a mortgage boom? We had a very mature housing sector in this country. We had been building a middle class, a home-owning middle class for 70 years. The market for good loans was very well established and therefore could not grow very quickly. So if you wanted to base your growth on that market, you had to do something else. You had to make the market in bad loans, in loans that would not be repaid. As a mathematical proposition, there is no limit on the number of loans you can make if you don't want them to be repaid. Right? You make your money on the fees originating them and on selling them off to gullible investors around the world, and especially in Europe. And that required, as Neil Barofsky has said, two things. An out-of-control financial sector taken over by companies the likes of AmeriQuest, which, according to a classic book by Bethany McLean and Joe Nocera, gave its mortgage origination officers crystal methamphetamine in order to improve their calling to customers. That is not, I think, the sign of an honest business. I asked the prosecutor for his view on the matter. I got the feeling that he would be skeptical of that practice. Right? And that had to be enabled, as Neil Barofsky said, by regulatory desupervision, which is what happened, the famous James T. Gilleran chainsaw press conference in which they brought in the regulations on the chainsaw. This was a not subtle signal of what the rules now meant. So all of this is part of what gave us the situation that we now face, and I think forces us to rethink what our prospects are going forward and how we have to protect ourselves. On the financial side, main focus of this morning, it seems to me that the accountability question is crucial, and the two previous panelists have made two very important points. One is personal accountability has not been there, and the other is that in the international system, it's very hard to establish institutional accountability, which raises the question, what is the function of these institutions now? We have relied on them for a generation, as I said, to provide the loans that fuel growth. They haven't done that. Are they going to resume doing that in the next 5 years? It would surprise me enormously. So it raises the question, when you have a deadweight cost on the economy, it's not just providing accountability or rules for these institutions, but asking whether we really need them and whether we wouldn't be better off with a financial sector that was half of its current size or a third of its current size. We used to get along with that level of financial services very effectively. Restructuring and reforming in that way might give us a better balanced economy going forward. Final point. Do we have a risk? And here's where I get to my silver lining. Do we have a risk of another financial panic that might prompt us to face the need for reform that we ducked in 2009? Well, the good news is I think we probably do face such a risk. And apart from Professor Coffey's points, which I think are very well taken, I would point to the situation in Europe, where you came very close with a very small economy a few months ago in Cyprus. Right? Greece is still very small as a fraction of the European economy, but it's 10 times as big as Cyprus. It's 2% of the total. Right? The European Union has got a strategy now. It's coming into place to move Ireland and Portugal to the back burner. Spain and Italy, things are still developing in those places. You could have a political upheaval in any of a number of European countries. Greece is the most likely. That would bring about a confrontation that the European system would not be able to handle. And just as the crisis here, the financial crisis here, quickly spilled over and precipitated the euro crisis, because the European financial institutions were deeply invested in toxic American assets and had losses that they had to cover. So I'm fairly sure that we would discover that an uncontrolled crisis in Europe would bring us back to serious difficulties of a character that I don't specifically know, and perhaps part of the problem is that we don't know in the United States. Thank you.
That's some silver lining. That's some silver lining.
So it looks like you're up, Senator Coffey.
Thank you. My job is kind of go through what caused the crisis. You can't really figure out how to fix it until you list what the causes are. So I think before we can answer the question, are we better prepared for the next financial crisis, what have we done to fix the causes? And my first job is to list the causes, and then we can talk about fixings to it. So let's start by saying the obvious. Not much has changed in Washington. There's not a whole lot that Congress agrees on. But in reality, if you go back to what Dennis's presentation, there wasn't much agreement in the Senate and the House in 2009, 2010, when we're considering Dodd-Frank. In spite of that, in spite of disagreement on just about everything, there was one thing that all members, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, unanimously agreed on, and that was the American taxpayer would never again bail out a big bank. So the first and I think most important question for today is the one raised by Elizabeth Warren. Are our banks still too big to fail? If they are, it's essential we fix it, and we fix it as soon as possible. Second, one of the causes of the crisis was clearly the banks were too heavily leveraged, their capital was too small, their liabilities were too large for institutions that finance themselves through short-term borrowing and long-term lending. Lots have been said and done, lots of talk about this, but really, today, are big banks now required to have the capital they need in a crisis? Third, as has been mentioned several times, there was clear agreement that derivatives were at the heart of the crisis. The authors of Dodd-Frank claimed, and this is what they said, eliminate loopholes that allow risky and abusive practices to go on unnoticed and unregulated, including loopholes in over-the-counter derivatives. My question is, much has been written about derivatives, but have all the loopholes truly been eliminated? Fourth, many say the major cause of the crisis, as Elizabeth Warren said, was the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. For the preceding 60 years, as she said, before repeal, we had bank problems, but we had no panics. They say that one of the causes of the crisis began when FDIC banks were free to engage in more risky investment banking. To recognize this, included in the watered-down version, was included in Dodd-Frank, was the Volcker Amendment. 3 years after Dodd-Frank, have we fixed the problem? Fifth, a majority of members of Congress on both sides of the aisles agreed with the panel and with Elizabeth Warren said. The lack of regulation and oversight by the executive and legislative branches of the federal government led to the crisis. Niels addressed this. He saw it up close and personal. During the debate, there were some who felt that Dodd-Frank did not offer enough clear answers to how to deal with the cause of the crisis. That it should have been bright line law. It should have been something like Glass-Steagall in there. And we kicked too many of the problems down the road to the regulators. I say in legislation, one of the hardest things is to deal with unintended consequences. I think the number of rules was an intended consequence. In addition, the Congress did not give the regulators an increase in funding they needed to deal with the 398 rules included in Dodd-Frank. As the latest Davis Polk law firm summary, only 155, or less than 40% of those rules have been finalized. With 60% of the rules outstanding, are we really ready for a potential financial crisis? Sixth, if you follow the debate in the Congress, or in fact the presidential campaign debate, you know that many inside and outside of Congress felt a major cause of the crisis, or a major cause of the crisis, was the behavior of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac informed to address these concerns? 7, we know from studies and studies and studies, the potential of ongoing jail is a real deterrent to white-collar criminals. It's the one thing that really works. Yet no one of the big banks is going to jail. In addition, until fairly recently, settlements of the banks did not even include the requirement that banks to admit or deny wrongdoing. High officials in the Department of Justice have stated publicly that criminal prosecutions should not be advanced in some cases where the prosecution may cause a financial institution to fail. Do we have in place the deterrents to avoid another financial crisis? In addition to this, my panel mates have laid out additional causes: behavioral to credit rating agencies, shadow banking and money markets, problems with the financial regulators in Congress, executive compensation, potential causes of a new crisis. It's a long list. Let us begin the discussion.
So I'm really glad that Neil was obedient and provided a silver lining, because I have to say, from where I sit, things look pretty bleak. So what all this reminds me of is something that Ben Bernanke said. Summer of 2009, you might remember this. This was around the time when people still remembered the headlines Dennis showed us, and the public was quite outraged about the massive intervention to save the financial institution when they had actually caused the crisis. And what he said was, we didn't intervene to help the banks, but when the elephant falls down, all the grass gets crushed as well. And so I think about that a lot, because when I look around, I see that the elephants are bigger and the grass is still crushed. And the data supports this. We've heard some of this, but just to remind everyone, the top 6 banks before the crisis, their total assets represented about 55% of GDP. As of the most recent quarter, it's higher now. It's 58% of GDP. The largest institutions are still permitted to be excessively leveraged, although they've increased their equity capital. And under the law, they're allowed to have as slim as a 3% equity capital cushion, which means borrowing for every $100 in assets they purchase, that's borrowing $97. Also, something that hasn't been addressed yet is a reliance on very short-term fragile funding through the wholesale markets, often referred to as the repo markets. And although this has gone down, still, the short-term and overnight tri-party repo funding is close to $2 trillion outstanding a day. And it was really the run on repo, both at Bear Stearns and at Lehman, that precipitated the financial panic. That has not been fixed. So that's the bleak note. But I think the good news is there's a lot of work ahead, and there's been some progress made. And so I want to start with Senator Kaufman, because he had an overview of a list of things to do. And I want to pose this question. Senator Warren said it's time for Congress to step in, either now or at the end of the year, when Jack Lew says if Dodd-Frank hasn't fixed too big to fail, it's time to step in. So I want to pose this question. If you were back in the Senate, where would you start? There are a number of bills that have been proposed, a number of problems you've identified. Which approach is the right one? Is it the 21st century Glass-Steagall? Is it the new version of Brown-Kaufman? Is it something else? Where do we begin?
Yeah, well, I was a co-sponsor, and Elizabeth Warren took my place. I co-sponsored with Senator Cantwell and Senator McCain on Glass-Steagall. I think Glass-Steagall, I think I'm a conservative on this. Let's go back to something that's worked for 60 years. The big problem is too big to fail. We have to figure out some way to get to too big to fail. And there isn't much energy on the Republican side or the administration to do this. I mean, I think Secretary Luke comment, if we look at the end of the year, we'll see whether Dodd-Frank's working on too big to fail, has got to be an interesting question. So I think that Glass-Steagall, the advantage Glass-Steagall has, number one, it gets the banks out of the risky business. The commercial banks, go back to that. People made money in the commercial banking business before we had Glass-Steagall. They could make money. It wouldn't make as much money. It'd be kind of a low risk, low return business. And then you have investment banking and all the other things. It could be high risk, high return. So split the two apart, and it quickly bring down the size of the banks. I also, Brown Vitter is a little different from Brown Kaufman, but I think that would be a good first step. But the truth of the matter is, the bad news is nothing is going to pass because there's no interest, just like if you go back and look at why Brown Kaufman failed. It failed because there was a liaison between the Republicans in the Senate and the Obama administration to bring it down. We got 33 votes. Go and look at the votes. Look who voted against this. It's a good mix of Republicans and Democrats who voted against this. So there's the chance that anything of this is going to happen. I mean, I say Glass-Steagall is eventually going to pass. It's just how much damage we're going to do before we put it back in. And right now, when I look at it, we're going to do a lot of damage before we put it back in. Now, I'm supposed to end with something good, and I'm not making this up. There really is something good. Anybody of you saw the Financial Times story on Tuesday where Mark Carney, who's the chairman of the Bank of England and also chairman of the Financial Stability Board, he came through, he said, we got to do something about too big to fail. And here's some of the things we're going to do about it. Really very, very promising. John Vickers, who wrote the Vickers Report in England, says we ought to increase the Tier 1 capital ratio to 20%. These are the kind of things that have to be out there and we have to talk about if, in fact, we're going to stop too big to fail. We can't do it by just inchy-pitchy. We can't do by little things like that. So I was in the Congress. I become a cheerleader for Glass-Steagall. I become a critic of my colleagues that were opposed to those kinds of issues. And I would be on the back of the administration saying, you've got to get on with this. This is important.
Great, thank you. Professor Coffey, you identified a few different areas of vulnerability that have resulted from the delegation from Congress to the agencies. With one of them, with the money market funds, you mentioned the capital buffer, which is something that was on one of the FSOC's proposals. But with credit rating agencies, can you tell us what the solution is? Would you go back to the Franken Amendment, or what? If you were in Congress, what would you do?
Okay. What I really was telling you is I gave you 3 examples where regulatory agencies have put forward cosmetic solutions because these problems are complex, and as long as you offer something the public doesn't quite understand. What would work with credit rating agencies? The SEC has thrown 1,000 new regulations at them. They're making credit rating agencies a regulated utility. That gives the SEC more power. Bureaucracies like that. But there's no vision, there's no attempt to make credit rating agencies more independent of the issuer. What would work? Because you can't simply have a subscriber pay system. We had that till 1975 and it failed. Information is a public good, it leaks out. You can't keep these ratings secret and subscribers won't pay. What I think you can do is give the right to select the rating agency to the debt purchasers. They are the end users. They are the people who really are relying on this information. They should select the rating agency. You could do that through a representative body. Debt purchasers could elect a council, a body that would change every 2 or 3 years perhaps, and they would select either for individual transactions or a group of transactions the rating agency. It won't end the dominance of the big 3, but it will make the big 3 compete for the loyalty of the investor. Right now, the big 3 are competing for the loyalty of the issuer. If they compete for the loyalty of the investor because the investors are selecting, it will make them much more responsive to what investors want, probably much more accurate. That's the kind of change that I think is feasible. I don't think we can expect that there'll be 100 new rating agencies appearing on the horizon. Okay?
Great, thank you so much. And Neil, on this topic of accountability, I very much enjoyed your insider's perspective from when you were the SIGTARP. And I noticed, I think, and we've heard a bit today, that there's no love lost between you and former Secretary of Treasury Timothy Geithner. And so maybe I'm putting it mildly. But,
I haven't gotten a Christmas card.
Okay. How about a Hanukkah card?
No,
not that. Okay. So I guess what I'm thinking about is this question of incentives. Is the concern about, is capture, in your view, simply a question of the system, the revolving door, et cetera, or is it also the person? And we've seen examples of folks like you, people like Sheila Bair and others who didn't succumb to pandering to industry interests. So is it the job? Is it the person? What's your insight here?
I think there's sort of a couple of interesting issues that are raised in that question. I think the question of the responsibility of the individual, and I'm obviously subscribed to the view that the government's response to the financial crisis was not only inadequate, but was harmful in ways and was particularly savage when it came to fulfilling its obligations to help homeowners. And so the question is Timothy Geithner, who was who ran point on this from the Treasury Department, is it just because Obama picked the wrong person, or is this a product of the system? And I think if you asked me that question a year ago, I would say I don't have anything personal against Tim Geithner. He was sort of the inevitable consequences of the failure of accountability. Some Rubin acolyte is going to get put into that position, whether it was Summers or Geithner or somebody else. They were going to continue in this sort of cosmetic approach to regulation and not do what was necessary to really get to the heart of too big to fail. When I read Sheila Bair's remarkable book, I think she took a different tact, and she, referring to Geithner as the bailouter-in-chief, and saw it as much more of a personal issue of personnel as making that decision. And as I said at the time, I disagreed with her, but I actually think that you've seen some remarkable things, and they may not be sufficient to turn the tide of our march to the next financial crisis. But since Geithner left, do you remember when Treasury Secretary Lew was going through his confirmation process? It was a key speech by a very senior Treasury official, Mary Miller, that could have been and probably was written by the bank lobbyists. It was, too big to fail, what are you talking about? There's no subsidy, they're just so big and great. That's why they borrow more cheaply. It's got nothing to do with any of this. And as the nominee, Lew suggested that Dodd-Frank had solved too big to fail. And that was very much the company line under Geithner. What's happened since he's left has been, I think, an evolution. I think Lew has come out of that lunatic fringe of denial that there's no problem, and has acknowledged that too big to fail continues. I don't think that's something we would have seen even imaginably beforehand. And you are seeing some degree of better regulation. We're seeing the leverage ratio not nearly high enough, but hey, it's higher. That's something. That's some sort of movement. And be curious to see what happens in the coming months when we finally get a Volcker rule, whether Lew meets this, when this deadline comes and passes, and I'm going to go out on an incredible limb and say in the next 3 months, too big to fail is not going to magically disappear because of some regulation. We'll see whether they put their money where their mouths are, but it sort of suggests to me that maybe Sheila was right, and that there is a lot about who the individuals are. And finally, I would say, the revolving door and regulatory capture are closely related, but are not necessarily lockstep. Secretary Geithner was thoroughly captured by Wall Street's interests. My interactions with him, he never worked a day on Wall Street. Others, like Gary Gensler, who spent a career at Goldman Sachs, I think most people would agree was a very robust regulator, one of probably the most robust regulators, and one of the more courageous people in this drama. And as someone who's just taken another spin through the revolving door, my comments should be, of course, probably taken with a grain of salt. I was a defense lawyer before I was a prosecutor, and now, once again, I'm in private practice, so I acknowledge that. But I think that while they're related, it's not absolute. And I think that we do need to, it's much more about the incentives that are baked within our regulatory system, and incentives for regulators not to be good regulators than necessarily the job they had immediately before or immediately afterwards.
Thank you. And Professor Galbraith, so I know that you're not a cheerleader for the next crisis, but that you...
What makes you say that?
I know that you're a cheerleader for the next crisis, because then perhaps if everyone's prepared, the proper structures and controls can be put in place. But it reminds me that there seems to be sort of one of the myths that's been perpetuated about this financial crisis and financial crises in general is a distortion of Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, which folks who may not know is this notion that stability will breed instability. But I think it's a distortion in that in his work, he suggests that can be prevented by the work of prudential supervision, and the hard work of central bankers to spread out the expansionary period. What this is to say, what do you think the central banks can do to help avoid future crises, or perhaps what could Greenspan have done to prevent the one we just experienced?
Okay. Well, before I get to that, I just want to say, for those who may not be familiar with Sheila Bair's thoughts on Secretary Geithner, I recommend the book salon that was held by Fire Dog Lake on Sheila Bair's very excellent book. I had the privilege of chairing it, and I wrote an introduction. And for the purposes of the introduction, I went through the book and simply took out and repeated everything she said throughout the book about Secretary Geithner. So you can get it all in a few paragraphs there.
Good stuff.
I didn't ask her permission for doing that, but I don't think she minded. On the question of the Minsky instability hypothesis. Hy Minsky was an economist of the second half of the 20th century. And the problem he was concerned about was the situation that gets you through a boom into a position where the financial sector is hopelessly over-leveraged in what he called a Ponzi phase and prone to collapse. I think that was a very important problem, and for that situation, his argument was that if you regulated properly, you couldn't eliminate the risk, but you could stretch out the expansionary period, and this was a good thing. It was the essence of using the financial system as a motor of economic growth. My view is that we are not in that situation now. We are in a situation much closer to the 1930s, actually, as an institutional matter, except that we haven't done what was done at the start of the 1930s to eliminate the detritus of the 1920s. All right? So we are in a situation where the financial sector is not going to be the motor of a new wave of real economic growth and job creation, a new middle class. It's not going to do this. Right? And so and it didn't from the 30s until the 50s. It really started up again well after the Second World War. So it's a long period of time that we have to think about what we do instead. And we need, I think, institutional reform and then new institutions that provide the kind of security, strengthen the security mechanisms for the middle class. Now, if you look at the New Deal didn't wait for prosperity before enacting Social Security. It enacted it in 1935. The minimum wage in 1935. The Wagner Act. Right? Not to mention the public jobs programs and the reconstruction programs, construction programs, the Tennessee Valley Authority, a whole range of things that rebuilt the American economy in the absence of a finance-driven system. That's what we need to think about. Where we are going in this discussion, which troubles me greatly, we have a whole panoply of budget hysterics. I'm on the mailing list of something called the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. You may have heard of it. It's located here. Which has been relentlessly trying to use the crisis as a way to pressure the political system to cut back the core protections that remain. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. This is essentially ripping out the intravenous bags from the patients in the emergency room. Right? It is a way of making the situation of Americans worse, which will inevitably make the economy worse as well. We need to rethink that entire approach to this and build institutions which are not dependent on the financial institutions, which are dysfunctional, but independent of them and that provide us with the foundations for a functioning economy, also on models that we are familiar with from our own past. And in that way, it seems to me that's consistent with the Minsky's general approach, but for the situation that we need to realize that we actually face at the present time.
Great, thank you. Now I'd like to invite any and all of you to raise your hands, and someone will find you and bring a microphone. I'm not sure. I can't see where the mics are. Right here? And please state your name and your affiliation.
Ford Ladd. I'd like to address this question to Professor Coffey and to Senator Kaufman. There was a young lady over here that raised an issue to Senator Elizabeth Warren earlier, and that was, what do we do about the argument raised by our banking industry stating that in order to be competitive in the world market, our system has to be able to compete with the European banks. Professor Coffey, I know you go to Europe quite often, and I know you address. How do we get our Congress to stand up and force that situation, or how do we get the European business community and legislative community to develop a more unified system, particularly in derivatives?
You know, I go to Europe regularly, just came back from a week in Sweden, and I hear the Europeans saying, well, we can't act because the Americans aren't agreeing, and we can't do anything unless the U.S. and both sides say they're paralyzed because there isn't international harmonization, and there won't be in the short run. I think you have to think about provisional solutions. We can't bet every chip we have on Brown, Vitter, and breaking up the big banks. At least provisionally, I think we have to say banks have too little capital to survive. They're too big to fail, but they have too little capital to survive. I believe the Federal Reserve has taken some positive steps. They have added what's called the American add-on to Basel III, and Europe is watching that, and some in Europe think that's the right thing. So if we had something stronger than Basel III, I think what the Federal Reserve could do, and is quietly considering, is force the large banks to slow down or cease their dividend payout to shareholders, which will hurt their stock price, in order to accumulate capital. You can get capital through public offerings. It's hard to force them to do that. They scream and complain. But you can get them to reduce their dividend payout and thereby accumulate capital and marginally reduce the risk of failure. I'd also add that the U.S. in some ways is better than Europe. European banks basically performed a lot worse than American banks in 2009. Why? In Europe, they essentially relied on capital adequacy, and they engaged in a process called risk weighting of the assets. Risk weighting allows the sophisticated to game the regulator, and the major banks know more than the regulator. They can come up with very complicated algorithms that say they've risk weighted their assets properly and they have adequate capital. The U.S. used not only capital adequacy, but a leverage ratio. Leverage ratios are simpler. You can't as easily game a leverage ratio. So I think we need multiple tools, leverage as well as capital adequacy, and we have to keep it simple because, frankly, the banks are basically smarter than the regulators, and the simpler system may work. So I think my answer to you is that we need to take some provisional steps and not wait for that ultimate moment of breaking up the big banks. We have to force them to accumulate capital, and that will mean their stock prices will fall and their stock options will not be as attractive, but the country will be safer.
I just don't think that nothing's going to happen in Congress. And I think, frankly, we're going to have to depend on the central bankers around the world. The central bankers around the world are talking. As I said, this Mark Carney, he's the new head of the Bank of England, and he's on the chairman of the Financial Stability Board. Read what he said in the Financial Times. It's much beyond anything. It's much beyond anything that we're talking about in the Obama administration, or a real chance of passing on the floor of Congress. The new Fed thing on capital rules, and Tarullo says this is just the beginning. That we're going to do this, and then we're going to do more. So I think if you come back and look at this thing, and we haven't teetered off into a crisis, I think the odds are now that the central bankers are going to get together. The British have the Vickers report. Excellent. They talk about a thing called ring fencing, where it's not Glass-Steagall, but they basically make the banks have subsidiaries, and they have a subsidiary that's a commercial bank, and a subsidiary is an investment bank. There are a lot of creative things going on in Europe. Deutsche Bank is really finally getting some real, they're really doing things to Deutsche Bank that I think are going to help. Now, Deutsche Bank needs a lot of help. But I think the capital requirements in Europe, the fact the Fed has expressed what they're going to do, but if we're looking for the administration or the Congress, we're looking for Brown, Vitter, or Glass-Steagall reform, or any of that, we're looking at the wrong place because the votes are just not there to do any. There's no interest in doing anything there on any of these issues. Just too big. The banks have too much control. It's been spelled out here beautifully on lobbying. I just say that one case. There's a colleague of mine at Duke Law School, Kim Krag. She did a study on the Volcker Rule. If you want to give up hope, just go look at her study. It's on the internet. Her last name's Krawiec. So she did a study for a year on the Volcker Amendment. which you know is before 4 regulatory agencies. And she checked on the contacts, the lobbying being done on the commissioners or the staff. You can go look at it. 92% of the contacts on the commissioners and staff was by Wall Street banks, accountants for Wall Street banks, lawyers for Wall Street banks, or financial trade associations. Only 8%, 3.6% or something like that was by the unions, and 3.6%, if you can believe it, was Senator Merkley and Senator Levin. Now, you know, as it's raised here, here's a regulator sitting there. We do have problems with revolving door. We do have problems with regulatory capture. They're sitting there, they're trying to make a rule. The panels are overwhelmingly Wall Street. If you go and look at the panels, I mean, I was telling somebody they had to not call for panel because the AFL-CIO person that usually shows up to be the other side was out of town. So, I mean, if you just go look at the panels and look what's going on, folks, and then at the end of the road, sitting there, in case anything should get by him, is, as someone said, the D.C. Circuit Court, which has this wonderful cost-benefit ratio analysis where I think that the SEC spent 3,000 pages or something on it, but that was not enough. We really need 7,000 pages. So I think the good news, the good piece of this thing, take a look at what Mark Carney is saying, what the Financial Stability Board is saying, what Vickers is saying, what the Brits are saying. There's a report out in the European Commission that's pretty good. I think central banks, they don't have to worry about the elected officials. God bless me, I love elected officials. But they don't have to worry about elected officials, and I think they really are trying to figure out how they can work this thing out.
Now, I would just suggest a catch-all response to whenever an argument is made that we can't do X, and whether it's higher capital or breaking up the banks or whatever it is, we can't do X because we'll be less competitive with the European banks. And my catch-all response is, why should I possibly care whether you're equally competitive with these giant, fully subsidized wrecks of banks? Like, why is the European bank our goal? Why do we want to emulate them? It's you know, they've had incredible destructive power in Europe. And you know, that shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be what is best for the public, what is best from a policy perspective. You know, having a bank that makes a little bit less profit because they're not able to enjoy a subsidy that a larger, too big to fail European or Asian bank is, like, that's not you know, a terrible thing for us, for them to make less profits, for that subsidy to come back and stay in our pockets. Because one thing about subsidies that we've learned from the financial crisis is that whether they're explicit or implicit, sooner or later they come home to roost. And Europe has suffered from that, and we have suffered from that. And what's really important is, do we have a better, safer, more secure financial system upon which we can build growth? And that really is the only question that matters. And the fact that the shareholders of some giant too big to fail bank may go down a little bit because they're less competitive with a fully subsidized European counterparty shouldn't be one that we care about. And again, if you go back to before Glass-Steagall's demise, you go back to the 90s, you know, what investment banks ruled? Was it the European universal bank model, or was it Goldman Sachs, which was 10% of its current size, that was the #1 investment bank in the world? It's a myth that you have to be of the same size as these European banks in order to compete. In fact, leaner, meaner, less conflicted could actually be a better, more competitive model.
Thank you. Another question. Right back there?
Hi, my name's Erin Arvidlin. I'm with the Philadelphia Inquirer. I have a question about derivatives for all panelists. I guess we could start with Mr. Borofsky. You were very, in your report on SIGTARP, you were very critical of the fact that derivatives were not regulated. And I wanted to ask you, a number of cities now, Boston, Philadelphia, Oakland, are filing suit against the banks to get their money back on these interest rate swaps and other derivatives that they bought. What do you make of the fact that the cities are kind of turning on the banks?
Well, first of all, if any of them need a good lawyer, it's kind of what I do now. I would be more than happy to pick up that mantle on behalf of the cities. But look, I mean, I think this is sort of going back to some of our themes of accountability, and I think how Senator Warren answered the question about the use of eminent domain out in California is that at some point when the regulators and our enforcement measures on the federal level fail to bring accountability, I think it's terrific that localities use all the tools in their toolkit to try to to recover losses. I mean, look, you look at some of these transactions, they're riddled with fraud, bribery at times, and these are complex financial transactions where a lot of localities got absolutely fleeced, and they should take up the mantle and use what's in their what the available legal remedies in order to make themselves whole. And look, it's one of the more remarkable things about how deep the capture is in this country to this handful of financial institutions, in that, as Senator Kaufman said, it's not as anyone in Congress who explicitly is in favor of bailing out the institutions. They're not popular. They're not in every district like the community banks are, that they should have exercised so much power. They're pretty located, in the Northeast, yet they still have this incredible muscle, this incredible dominance and control, as I saw, of our regulatory system and a good chunk of Congress. And this is something that was built up over decades and decades and decades. This wasn't just sort of an accidental thing that happened in 2008. And it's going to take a long, long battle to try to beat back from that. But I think it's encouraging when we see localities taking on the large financial institutions and trying to get a good remedy for their taxpayers.
Let me add just a chilling note to this. I agree with everything you're saying, but because of the Supreme Court has limited the scope of our anti-fraud rules to transactions occurring on American shores, many of those financial institutions have learned that if they were today to sell the same transaction to the municipality of Boston or Oakland, if they put the venue of that sale in Europe, they are beyond the fraud rules. And this would go back to this problem of extraterritoriality. The Congress did give extraterritorial jurisdiction to the SEC and the CFTC and Dodd-Frank, but they are not using it. The SEC enthusiastically adopted substituted compliance. The CFTC grudgingly went there, partly because they were undercut by the SEC, but on the fraud rules, if you structure the transaction outside the United States, and mobile institutions can go anywhere in the world, you escape the scope of Rule 10b-5 and our anti-fraud rules. So there still is a bleak possibility that they will be able to escape litigation in the future.
Right here, the second row.
Well, I'd just like to say one thing. My name is Dave Christie. I'm with the LaRouche Policy Committee. I'd like to say one thing on the idea that we don't have the support for Glass-Steagall. 25 states have introduced memorials calling on the Congress to act, so there's wide support in the country. But internationally, Switzerland has also introduced Glass-Steagall type regulations, joining Italy in Europe as well, because I think there's...
Can I ask you to state a question for one of the panelists?
Okay, yeah, real quick. Dodd-Frank protects the globally systemic important financial institutions. Title II, the Orderly Liquidation Authority, changes the priority status such that the derivatives leveraged internationally through these G-SIFIs would be protected before the depositors. So this is what we saw threatened in Cyprus, what we're seeing in Detroit, the idea that Dodd-Frank can loot the deposits, the pensions, and so forth. So
maybe I can find a question in here. I appreciate your comments. Maybe someone on the panel wants to talk about the Orderly Liquidation Authority under Title II and some of these concerns about cross-border issues and whether it's even feasible. Senator?
Well, I felt from the beginning when they introduced it that Orderly Liquidation Authority would not work, especially when you have these gigantic banks. But if you go again and just look at the Financial Stability Board in Europe, any bank that any of our big banks went down would have to be resolved in Europe as well as the United States. The Financial Stability Board, in their latest report, it was either April or May, said there are not in place the administrative needs that we have to have cross-border resolution authority. Mark Carney, in his thing, I keep coming back to it because I think it's really important that someone say. It says that one of the things they have to do is they have to get the Financial Stability Board has to come up with a way to get this done. Now, can you imagine how long it's going to take to resolve across all these borders to have order liquidation authority? So this is a problem that's going to be with us for a long time. But the key has to be the Financial Stability Board has got to figure out how they're going to do it in Europe, and then we got to figure out how we're going to do it across the world. Because as John Coffey said, this is an international world. These international banks, and they will use anything they can, whether it's the derivatives legislation, whatever it is, in order to get something overseas where they can then do the same thing they did before. If we don't look at what the causes were of the last one, how much this stuff was done overseas, we're not going to be able to solve the problems in the future.
And it's important to remember that the international implications of the Lehman bankruptcy was one of the key reasons of why the crisis was so bad. And an OLA that doesn't deal with that sufficiently is
3 years.
Took
3. Can you imagine Citibank? You're waiting around for 3 years.
Right, and so I think the thing with OLA is that you probably don't need to worry about the details, because if we are going into another crisis, it ain't going to be OLA. It's going to be TARP 2.0 or 3.0 or something like that.
Right over here.
Thank you for taking my question. And my name is Andrea Pastoris. I'm a bank analyst from New York. I'm acquainted with Professor Coffey, Borofsky, and Galbraith. It astonishes me, and please, the question in part is, what are reflections, and why haven't there been reflections? I mean, we repealed prohibition because we thought it was inferior or flawed, or the time had come to repeal that. So with regard to multilateralism, again, and thank you for those who've understood this issue, how come we haven't reflected very carefully and broadly on what's thwarted American constitutional compliance? So to repeal U.S. compliance and signatory status to G20 and thereby eliminate the spurious correlation that our economists think that we've had no job growth because of technological advancement.
Can you just state a concise question about G20 for the panel?
Well, the G20 problem and the ISDA problem are that these are institutionalized frameworks that either override or circumvent U.S. law, constitutional law. ISDA gets to ride above the law by way of the big banks.
Can I just ask you to phrase a question, or does one of the panelists want to pick this up?
So go right ahead, but then we'll have job growth, because no net new job growth is under G20.
Thank you. Because I didn't hear a question there, I think I'm going to ask someone else. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Pat Malloy. I was general counsel of the Senate Banking Committee in 1988 when we wrote a provision of law requiring Treasury to identify currency manipulator countries. And I want to get this question out. Since about the last 20 years, we've run $7 trillion worth of trade deficits. And part of the way that has happened is other countries are underpricing their currencies as part of their export-led growth strategies. When our dollars go over there to buy the goods, the central banks take them off the market as a way. That's part of the way they underprice their currency, and they buy our treasuries. There's been trillions of dollars by foreign governments buying U.S. treasuries. Has anybody? I've heard different economists say that has been part of what the financial crisis in this country. There was a surfeit of liquidity being pumped into our country as part of this currency manipulation process. Has that ever been discussed as part of this problem that we're dealing with, and a need to have an international solution to deal with that problem?
I think the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report directly addressed that question. I don't recall their exact conclusion, but I think that that it was a factor, but not necessarily a significant factor. And this is the idea that because there was this liquidity glut, that the money had to go somewhere, and where it went was AAA-rated subprime mortgages and their complex brethren. So I think that's been considered. I think, look, the demand side for those securities is relevant. I think there's a lot of things that went into it beyond the international liquidity glut. But I think that's been considered as a factor.
Pat, hi, it's good to see you. I just take a different view on this issue. I think they're at least as distinct as economic issues can normally get. The Chinese were not in the business of buying toxic subprime mortgage derivatives. They bought U.S. treasuries and agencies, and they have followed a fairly conservative strategy, and it served their internal development purposes to be running a trade surplus, which the counterparty was they had to have a financial asset that represented the accumulation of those surpluses. No real instability emerged from that related to the financial crisis. Financial crisis emerged for the reasons that we've discussed. That is to say, U.S. financial institutions making untenable loans which were destined to collapse and then selling packaged versions of them to gullible investors with the imprimatur of ratings agencies that either didn't know what they were doing or possibly did know what they were doing. Right? And that, I think, is what we can, safely say was the principal financial impetus behind the debacle.
My name is Navin Bikari. I'm a research student at the law school at George Washington. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I have a question in two parts addressed to Professor Coffey. Maybe a little bit technical, but the issue of substituted compliance giving rise, if I understood you correctly, to regulatory arbitrage in the context of offshore, by channeling your transaction to offshore. How important is this an issue? Because we have heard a lot about offshore from the taxation perspective, and a lot of pressure recently at the level of G8 and G20 on taxation in the context of offshore. So how important is this question of regulatory arbitrage? And secondly, the related question, am I misreading you when you say that substituted compliance is inconsistent with extraterritoriality principles? Thank you.
Okay. Substituted compliance says that if you comply with the foreign country's law, you are deemed to comply with the U.S.'s law. Now, that subject to the condition that the regulatory body finds that the two legal regimes are, on a holistic basis, substantially similar. The danger here is that large financial institutions are incredibly mobile. And if you are restricted from taking high-risk activities in the U.S., and you can just move your derivatives office to Europe and engage in the same credit default swaps, don't forget that AIG had its credit default swap office actually in London. So if you can avoid U.S. regulation, U.S. rules on reducing counterparty risk and using clearinghouses and using margin by going off to someplace, the Cayman Islands, Monaco, there always will be some country that can profit from regulatory arbitrage, and you'll make them rich by producing a haven for basically running high-risk financial casinos. So there is a danger here. I'm not saying substituted compliance is all wrong. If there really was negotiations between the two countries so they came to agreement on a truly substantially similar system, then I have no problem that there are technical differences. But understand, the U.S. has some rules that aren't matched anywhere in the world. For example, the Volcker rule is not matched anywhere in the world. If a U.S. bank could avoid the Volcker rule by moving an office to Europe and engaging in proprietary trading in Europe, they have innovated everything Congress sought to do, and that's still to be resolved. We don't know. We know the CFTC is resistant to this, and I think properly so, and Mr. Gensler has been a leader here. But the SEC is quite enthusiastic about substituted compliance, and it's going to be a still unresolved debate. This is exactly the area where I think greater accountability and sunlight has to be focused on the regulatory agencies themselves.
Good morning and thank you. Professor Coffey started this talk.
Can you identify yourself and your affiliation, please?
Yes, my name is John Huang from Treasury. And Professor Coffey started his talk today talking about change and the Dodd-Frank rule, that strategy that was taken, not really being effective anymore. Since we're in a law school today, going forward, a crisis can be a strong impetus for innovation and change, new frameworks and new ways of thinking about things. Do you have ideas about how strategies and legal frameworks can change in the future in order to have an environment more receptive to stability?
Well, that's a very broad question. Let me endorse something that Senator Kaufman said. I do think that the central banks are having very good cooperative discussions. The unique thing about the United States is that the impact of lobbying and political interest groups is higher here in terms of its impact on financial regulation. Citizens United is a unique problem in our system,
but the central banks are the one agency that's relatively immune from the citizens bank problem. So I think that the central banks, Federal Reserve and FDIC, are doing better than, say, the SEC and some of the other more specialized agencies, which are more subject to regulatory pressure and the loss of their budgets in Congress. So that's a partial answer, but I have to say that central banks should be able to deal with systemic risk. I find that the older agencies just think their job is disclosure or something else and don't want to take on the mandate of truly pursuing reduced systemic risk.
Hi, I'm Nick Verbitsky with PBS Frontline. I'm currently producing a documentary film about insider trading, and one of the recent developments that's taken place caught my eye, and that's the failure to supervise charge of Stephen Cohen at SAC Capital. How much of this problem with accountability that we've been talking about here from the financial crisis is maybe a failure of legal imagination? Because certainly a failure to supervise seems very apropos for a guy like Dick Fuld or for Jimmy Kane. Can you just speak to that for me and maybe just discuss about whether or not a failure to supervise charge might be appropriate for some of these financial crisis cases? Thank you.
You want to start?
I mean, look, one of the things about SIGTARP is that we ran a law enforcement agency, and one of our now we did not have jurisdiction over financial crisis related crimes for the simple matter that our jurisdiction started on October 3rd, 2008. Anything that happened beforehand really wasn't within our bailiwick unless they tried to get TARP funds. But we were investigating complex financial transactions and accounting frauds related to them for hundreds and hundreds of banks that entered into the TARP system. And I often found a lack of expertise and timidity when dealing with those who would be responsible for bringing charges based on the evidence that we gathered. And and I think that there was this fear of losing that was really heightened after the acquittal of the two Bear Stearns hedge fund executives in 2009, and the real pasting that the Department of Justice took, particularly in the pages of the Wall Street Journal and other publications. I sensed a bit of a chill that went down the spine of the department. And I thought that we had cases that could have been brought, should have been brought, other cases that I think should have been brought much sooner than they were eventually brought. But we were being dealt with a standard that was in my view, far beyond proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now look, as a law enforcement agency head, that's not an unusual complaint or fetching. That's what law enforcement agents do with prosecutors. I know because I was a prosecutor and was on the receiving end of that fetching. But I think that had something to do with it. And I also saw a lack of sophistication often in dealing with these cases, and a susceptibility to arguments from very sophisticated defense counsel that were basically able to take advantage of that timidity and fear. So I'm not talking about any specific case that you mentioned, but I think that had a lot to do with it. I think that taking on some of the targets that you suggested would have been extraordinarily high profile, high risk, and I just don't think there was an appetite unless there was truly this proof beyond any doubt before it would have been pursued.
Let me add one word to this. I started out my talk by saying the federal regulatory agencies are showing a great deal of risk aversion, and that's particularly true in the enforcement area. As you may have been suggesting, the SEC never sued any officer at Lehman Brothers. That was notwithstanding the fact that the bankruptcy examiner for Lehman Brothers, who was also the chairman of Jenner and Block, to throw in a plug for you, wrote a 500-page report in which he detailed just what theories could have been pursued. The New York Times last week gave us the detailed account and told us that Mary Shapiro wanted to sue because she knew the public wanted it, but the enforcement staff said, no, we're not sure we can make a case. And the Times left that rather vague, saying that the enforcement chief was only interested in doing justice. I would point out that the Times left out one fact. When the SEC did not sue, the private plaintiffs' bar did sue. The case went before one of the tougher judges in New York, Judges Lewis Kaplan, who denied the defendant's motion to dismiss and said there was plenty of evidence of fraud for this case to go forward, and it settled for $1 billion. This, to me, is one of those examples where risk aversion dominated what we really want prosecutors to do. A good prosecutor is going to lose some cases, and we're talking here about civil cases. I don't believe in willy-nilly indicting people, but the SEC should be pursuing its theories. The Lehman story is a story about something called the 105 repo transactions, which were basically just designed to hide the facts from shareholders and to hide the level of leverage. You're in the field too. Add something.
Well, I guess I'll step out of my moderator role. Right. I mean, the repo 105 transactions allowed them to basically hide $50 billion off balance sheet. So also using a cross-border strategy.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And I think one of the slightly infuriating aspects of the New York Times account of what happened on Repo 105 was the suggestion that the reason why they didn't think it was good because it was not material, because Lehman was reducing leverage anyhow. And the answer to that is it's $50 billion. I think most investors might have found that material.
Especially if you considered that right around the time they were engaging in this at I think it was at the first quarter conference call, I believe, the folks on that call were talking about how they were deleveraging and becoming more liquid. And, so I think that a person might be able to put these pieces together and make a case.
Thank goodness for civil plaintiffs and their law firms.
Right here in the front row.
Thank you. I'm John Parsons from MIT. And I want to key off something that Mr. Borowski said a moment ago about what kind of banks do you want. I thought it was a very good point. And I want to connect it to derivatives. I think one of the biggest problems in the regulation of derivatives and the debate about derivatives is a lot of people have been convinced we need the OTC derivatives market unregulated and opaque and all of those characteristics because we'd be afraid what would happen if we did it otherwise. And I think if we ask questions like you asked with regards to the banks and said, I'm perfectly fine with having a derivatives market, but a well-regulated derivatives market, we used to have in the United States in the mid-20th century the best derivatives markets in the globe, and they were all cleared, they were all exchange traded, and they provided stability and growth. So I think this question of intellectual capture is exactly the real question that we have to get at in a lot of areas, because we have people who demonize things. We have other people in a lot of the lobbying on derivatives. The banks put end users as their face person for the lobbying, their front man, because they needed to say the economy might fall down. And it's a problem that a very large amount of the American business community is captured still.
So I'm enjoying what you're saying, but
that's my comment.
That's your comment. Excellent comment. Thank you. You want to respond to that?
No. I just think that we underestimate, as Neil said and other people said, you just underestimate what the difference in the amount of money that's being spent moving ideas in this country, what an incredible difference it makes. It isn't just Kim Krowiak's study on the amount of lobbying. We talk about lobbying. We talk about campaign finance reform. That's a serious point. But the amount of money that's spent finding academics who are willing to write academic papers to come to say some of the most ridiculous things on the face of the earth, and they're not, I don't think that they give an academic the money and the academic does it. I think they just go and they search in all the thousands. Just look at the deniers on climate change to bring it up. You can find somebody to believe just about anything, but the relentless manner, every letter to the editor, you write a column, next thing you know, next day, the letters to the editors are in there. The comments are in there. Everything that's done, every time there's a symposium, they've got people. When there's a round table for the Securities Exchange Commission or the CFTC, look at the people that show up. And it isn't just people walking in the door with a Goldman Sachs thing on. They're walking in with some of our major universities written on their name tag, and they're saying, this is how we have to. This is a big problem, as Neil said, that's been developed over many, many years, and it's just totally encompassing. And the derivatives thing's a perfect example of how were they able to say that the United States should not regulate derivatives. Just take that one issue and spend a little time thinking about that.
Yeah.
How did that, not just how did that happen?
A one-sentence footnote to this. It is to a considerable degree a new and exponentially growing problem because it is the Citizens United problem. It wasn't always this bad, and it distinguished the U.S. from Europe, where we don't see anything like the same level of political contributions or anything like the same level of interest group lobbying. It's a problem that needs to be addressed through greater disclosure, but unless Citizens United is some way curbed, I think we're going to see the dominance of special interests and lobbying, keeping regulatory agencies risk-averse and small-minded.
By the way, there's a case coming up in McCutcheon in October that is well position to make this thing, if you can believe it, even worse.
John, I think that's, I'm sorry, but just.
I want to maybe tie you in on this because this question of conflicts of interest in research, I believe the AEA addressed this last year. Do you remember this? The American Economics Association, because there was no sense, there was no sense, I think, among the economics profession that it was necessary to disclose who was paying you to do particular research or write papers about, let's say, Icelandic banks, et cetera.
Well, we shall see how well that works. But on the European question, I think the key point in Professor Coffey's remark was that we do not see the lobbying in Europe. Yeah. It may be a bit of an advantage that we do see it here. The European governments have a toxic relationship with their banking systems, which is part of the problem. And you have, the Greek situation, you have a local oligarch being handed over vast quantities of state assets. And that is because the other European banks are blocked out of that market to a degree. And getting rid of that would be a step forward in the European case. But the other question I just wanted to ask, it might be a naive question for my legal counterparts here. Given the way the Supreme Court has constructed the anti-fraud statutes, why would any fiduciary in the United States be able to get away going forward with buying any financial instrument that didn't have written on it prominently, this transaction occurs within the legal framework of the United States and is entirely subject to the anti-fraud protections of U.S. law, period, like a cigarette warning. Any other confection is going to be very dangerous to your health.
It certainly would be desirable if institutions learned that buying in the United States carried with it greater legal protections. But that they do understand that in the equity markets. There's something called bonding. There's a premium for the stock that's listed in the United States. But debt purchasers think they're all sophisticated and they go where the cheapest rates are, and there are slower transaction costs and less margin. If you buy a debt security in the U.S., you're going to have to pay margin. If you bought it someplace else, margin isn't posted. They go for the cheaper price, ignoring that they don't have any protections.
Cigarette consumers used to have the same view of their own sophistication. The labeling did help with that.
The one thing I just wanted to add to the discussion, especially of the lobbying, is that and forgive me for pandering, but it really shows you why Better Markets is such a crucial organization. And the fact that we have this today, this discussion, the headlining of Senator Warren and us getting to talk about this stuff and trying to bring some transparency to it, and some small counterweight to the lobbying Goliath of Wall Street, and encouraging a free flow of reform-minded ideals. I just wanted to thank Dennis and sponsors of Better Markets, because without that, it really would just be a slaughter. So this at least gives us some chance.
It really is. When you look out there, just the next time you see a major financial movement by one of the regulators or someone else, and you see the 27 bank, lobbyist, public relations firms giving their statement, and then somewhere in there is Dennis Kelleher talking about Better Markets. It is, talk about David and Goliath. I think David and Goliath was used earlier. This is David. And they are the only ones in many ways. A lot of it's because the unions are not as involved as they used to be. The consumer groups can't get the money. But they are the one folks who are on the line making the points that have to be made in order for us to get a view, the regulators to have a view and have something they can go and say, we passed this regulation because we know this.
I have time for two more questions right here.
Thank you. Bill Day, I'm a lawyer in town. Since what I'm hearing is that we can't rely on our president, we can't rely on our Congress, we can't rely on our regulators, and we certainly can't rely on the banks to deal with this problem. To follow up on the last series of questions, what is it that we can do, at least as a first step, to enlist the public in their own interest to address the problem?
Great question.
Was that to me? All right. I would say that we have to hold not only the banks but the regulators more accountable. When the regulators come up with cosmetic solutions to take pressure off them, such as the SEC's approach to credit rating agencies, which is simply to rearrange the deck chairs, or when we see the regulators accepting substituted compliance and a world of enforced regulatory arbitrage, there's got to be more objection. It's got to be pointed out that they are abandoning their duty. And when something like Lehman doesn't get sued for 3 years, statute of limitations is now run, I think we want the journalists to focus on just why it was that this company escaped even civil enforcement. In Lehman, the SEC can sue simply based on negligence. They don't have to prove fraud at all. But they didn't go after Lehman, and that's the kind of failure. I think now the public has begun to learn that something was seriously amiss in the regulatory and enforcement response to the 2008 crash. And because the public is dissatisfied, we've seen the first hints that a new SEC chairman is going to be a somewhat tougher cop on Wall Street. I think the public does create an expectation, and eventually regulators respond.
Yeah, I think, when Simon Johnson wrote his sort of remarkable book on regulatory capture in the financial crisis, 13 Bankers, he cites the scene where President Obama is sitting with the 13 CEOs of the largest financial institutions and says, "I'm the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks." So my answer to your question is more pitchforks.
And one last question here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Michael. I'm with the GW Law School. I'm a 1L, so 2008 I was in senior year of high school when all this was happening, and since then I've accrued a lot of student loan debt, and I was wondering, asking you close to my heart, is the student loan bubble, do you think, could that be a risk for the next financial crisis, if that pops, if you think it's a bubble, and if you think so, how can we deflate it? And if it pops, what's going to happen? And also, really quick, are any of you more pro-Summers than pro-Yellen? Just curious. Thank you.
So we've got a two-part question. One, maybe something about the $1 trillion student loan debt, bubble or not a bubble, and then perhaps someone wants to chime in on the Fed chair nomination.
All right. Well, look, it's the rate of default on student loan debt is staggering. I don't know enough about it to know whether it's a bubble that could cause a crisis. So much of it is, of course, government guaranteed explicitly. And look, I think that it's a very interesting political question about the Yellen-Summers debate. I think it's pretty clear from my comments earlier, probably where I weigh in on the issue. But it's the politics behind this are something extraordinary. I mean, when you think about the fact that that Larry Summers was involved with the original 13 Bankers telephone call and leading this response, and when I look at the justifications that are provided in the media of why Summers is favored over Yellen, I think it tells you a lot about where our financial system is and where it's heading. And that is one of the justifications that's repeatedly given is that he is the person who's best equipped with a future financial crisis. And what that means is we want someone in place who we know will bail out. And I think that says a lot because in Senator Kaufman's comment before, it's going to be very, very hard when the next crisis hits to get something through Congress in time before we're really in a devastating situation. The idea that we're going to be able to pass a bill to put equity into the financial institutions again, sooner or later I think it will happen, but it's going to be further down the line. We're going to need not just Lehman falling, but probably AIG and someone else before that response. So that's going to put a tremendous amount of pressure on the central bank to do what it did under 13.3, which has been narrowed by Dodd-Frank, and its hands been somewhat turned. So the idea is to have someone who has demonstrated a willingness and ability, I think, to push the envelope in the next financial crisis. And I think that's a lot behind why we're seeing at least the justification for Larry Summers over Janet Yellen, who's been at least publicly a little bit more critical of the largest financial institutions.
Whether the student loan question poses a threat to financial institutions is, to me, a secondary question. The way the student loan system has been structured so that it becomes a particular kind of debt that you can't escape is a travesty. It is a fundamental breach of fairness. It is a gift to the financial institutions at the expense of effectively the personal liberty of a whole generation of people. It is also a very poor way to run a higher education system because it completely distorts the career choices that young people are going to be making. So for all these reasons, and I think this financial question is really not the least of them, but very far down the list, this issue does need to be addressed. On the other question, I have to say that I was an undergraduate in 1970 in what may have been the very first classroom that Assistant Professor Janet Yellen stepped into at Harvard College. And I remember she looked around and said, "I assume you're all familiar with the Keynesian model." And I had been a fine arts major up to that point, and I didn't know what she was talking about. And I said, "Galbraith, you're in trouble." But anyway, that'll give you a feel for where I stand on this. I do think that a service that could be done for the country, and that would not be unfair to Larry Summers if the president nominates him, would be to make clear now what questions will be raised and will have to be answered in the confirmation process. The questions of public policy above all, but also other questions. And that, I think, is entirely fair to everybody. And if those were laid out in a fully systematic way, it might influence the way the president makes this decision.
When I was in business school, there was a fellow named Arch Patton. He wrote an article that we talked about a lot in business school at the time, 437 years ago. And Patton's thesis, which is is kind of a, well, yeah, so what? But really has stood me in good stead over the intervening years. As he said, if you want to know what an organization really values, don't look at what they say they value. It's who they hire and who they fire. Now, if you believe that repeal of Glass-Steagall was a great idea, and you believe the Community Futures Modernization Act was a great idea, if you think defeating Brown-Kaufman was a great idea, if you think opposing real legislation in the bill is a good idea, then Larry Summers is your guy. I mean, he was there for all that. He came down and argued with me about Brown-Kaufman being a bad idea. Now, of course, Tim Geithner did too. But I'm just saying, you sit here and the question was asked, what do we do about this? And the public really cares. If the public, I'm a big believer in the public. I'm a real believer. This stuff is so complex. I just sometimes don't know. You talk to people, it's hard for them to get it. But the fact that there isn't riots in the streets with the idea of Larry Summers being head of the Fed is an indication of how deep our problem is. It isn't just about the money. It isn't just about the lobbying. It isn't just about the public relations. The rest of it is this guy is the godfather of, if you believe anything that was said here, if you believe what Elizabeth Warren said, if you believe what a lot of what we're saying, he was right there at the place for every one of these things. And now we're going to make him the head of the Fed?
Well, I think that's where we should end.
Thank you all. Very good.